Well, Mike, welcome back to the show, man. It's great to visit with you.
Yeah, it's good to be here, Cable.
Yeah, it's been probably a couple years, I think, since our last conversation. I don't really remember, to be honest with you, what we even spoke about. I'm sure it had to do with ducks and duck hunting, but
It
the
probably
topic,
did.
yeah, the topic escapes me. However, so where are you jumping on from today?
Memphis, our national headquarters here in Memphis, Tennessee. For 13 years, from I guess it would have been 2005 to 2018, I was working out of Lafayette, Louisiana, as a for the Gulf Coast Joint Venture.
Uh huh.
But I guess a couple of years ago, I moved here to Memphis as a waterfowl scientist within our national headquarters. So I report directly to our chief scientist for a number of years. That was Dr. Tom Mormon. He
Yeah.
retired at the end of last year, and now Dr. Steve Adair is our chief scientist.
Okay. Yeah, I had sent Tom an email about this conversation, and we've spoken frequently over the last couple of years. And he was like, "Well, Cable, I retired."
Yeah,
So, uh, but but it's great to visit with you. It looks like you're
sure.
actually in the office.
We are. We're starting to repopulate our office here in Memphis. For the longest time, we were at greatly reduced capacity,
Mm-hmm.
you know, 10, 20%, something of that nature. We're probably up to about, I don't know, 40% capacity in here right now.
Okay.
Still being cautious with our interactions and kind of following appropriate guidelines, that type of stuff. But it
Mm-hmm.
feels good to get back in the office and start to see people in the hallways and things of that nature. So
Yeah.
we're getting there.
Well, so I think kind of along that 40% vein, a bit. That's like the Ducks basically took the year off from coming to Texas because of COVID too. Like they I don't know what happened, man. They weren't here, but a lot of people wanted me to visit with a DU scientist to figure out what actually happened. And I think it sounds so cliche, but if we get the cold weather, the Ducks generally show up. This year, I'm sitting in the blind more often than not in nylon breathable waders. I never even broke the neoprene ones out. And some days it's like you're swatting mosquitoes away, and you're sweating, picking up decoys. So it was a very mild winter as far as this far south is concerned. And I did hear reports from guys on the coast that were banging away on redheads and pintails, but by and large, like North Texas, just it's like it got skipped over. And we limited out opening day, saw a lot of ducks, and after that, um, it was pretty abysmal. Worst duck season myself and the people I hunt with, people that I talk to, have ever
Yeah.
had.
Wow.
So I don't know if you could shed any light on maybe if there's some migration patterns that have been altered through agricultural practices, or I've heard over the years that maybe ducks are using more like farm ponds than big reservoirs and not going all the way to the coast in some cases. But you obviously know more about it than I do, so uh, pick your brain on that.
Sure. I think any of the suggestions that you came up with there, any of the hypotheses, as we would kind of call them, are probably in play at some level in some years. That's the unsatisfying thing about any
Like,
of these.
here's your loaded gun. Deal with it.
Yeah, that's the unsatisfying thing about this conversation anytime you have it, is because that, and our human nature is to say, what's the one thing, what's the
Sure.
one thing that's causing this observation that I'm making, that I'm seeing. In nature, there is never a single factor. Now, there are factors that are more important than others, and that's the way that we try to approach this, is to tease out all those different factors that are responsible for waterfowl movements, abundance, the timing of those things. But obviously, when you're dealing with a migratory resource, that becomes incredibly complex. I was listening to a podcast a few weeks ago with Dr. Mike Chamberlain. He is a
Hmm.
turkey biologist out of the University of Georgia. He and
Yeah,
I
just
over.
talked to him last week, actually.
Did you really?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So he and I overlapped for a few years at Mississippi State, and it was funny because I was listening to that podcast, and he was talking about kind of this same thing. People want to know what's the explanation for a decline in turkey populations that we're seeing, and he's like, we always want that one answer, but
Uh-huh.
there is no one answer. It's a multitude of factors. So what I can do, Cable, and I don't know if you saw this. I don't know how well we've circulated it yet, but one of the things that we did this past year was pull together something that we're calling a season in review, and I can provide you a link to it, and you can attach it to the podcast or whatever website you have. But we kind of take a stepwise approach of looking at pulling data from various websites on weather and and other indices of habitat condition and even midwinter survey data, and summarize that in a nice little publication that we can share with people to say, of those factors that we know from past science that has an influence on the timing of waterfowl migrations and abundances, this is what they looked like throughout the autumn and winter of last year. And so it includes things such as precipitation. I'm looking at it right now. Departures from average is kind of one way to look at it. Precipitation, temperatures, stream flows, snow cover, Great Lakes ice cover as sort of an index of how cold it was or how warm it was throughout most of the winter up in some of the northern latitudes, and then midwinter survey data. There's nothing in this report that says, hey, this is what caused what it was that you were seeing, but it does, I think, shed some light on really the way the season unfolded. And so with that, and to kind of get to your question, what I can do is say that we spoke with a lot of people on our Ducks Unlimited podcast last year to try to keep a handle on how the season was unfolding in various locales, and throughout most of the eastern U.S. The responses that we received were, I mean, almost wash, rinse, repeat, almost the same thing. In late October, we had an unusually cool few weeks. There were a few weeks in late October when things got unusually cool, and that did what we expected it to do based on the way we understand waterfowl populations and their migrations. It led to an early push of birds, too early for some people. I talked to some hunters in Missouri that said, boy, I wish this cold weather would have waited a couple of weeks because their season was closed when
Which it probably explained why we did well opening weekend.
Most definitely, most definitely. And that was one of the things that we've heard from some of our members and partners in Texas, is that, yeah, it was good early on. The other thing that we heard was it was one of the best teal seasons ever for many people. There's a couple of things that would be driving that. One of which would be just exceptional wetland conditions in the Dakotas, notably South Dakota. That's the other thing that we included in this report, was a couple of figures that tried to kind of capture, because we didn't have the BPOP or habitat data last year, but we just kind of pulled some precipitation data to show how that might explain what we expected, what we heard about habitat conditions in the Dakotas. Dry in the prairies of Canada, but the Dakotas were pretty good, and so we know that blue-winged teal are going to stop at some of the first places that they find water, and that was in the Dakotas, and they found a lot of it, and they had really good production by all accounts. That revealed itself, the rewards of that revealed itself to hunters in the form of a really good teal season by all accounts. Then you get into the big duck season, and you get the cold push in October, and I think that was good for some of the early hunts. Now, the thing that hindered hunters in the Mississippi Flyway, certainly the southern end of the Mississippi Flyway, and again, here we're starting to layer on these different factors, was it was dry. It was dry for a lot of those historically important regions in Arkansas and Mississippi. And there's been some research out of Arkansas in the past few years that show that, and Mississippi as well, that show one of the things that determines regional scale water, or influences regional scale waterfowl abundance, is the amount of habitat on the landscape. I mean, you can have a small section of really high quality waterfowl habitat, and yeah, if you got the birds there, you could support a lot of them for a long time. but waterfowl are making these decisions on where they go at different scales in space. And so these areas that have a lot of water on the landscape, especially if it's really good habitat associated with that water, those areas are going to have a lot of ducks. They're going to see a lot of ducks. But the fact that a lot of those areas in Arkansas and Mississippi had low stream levels, had low precipitation, they just did not have much habitat early in the hunting season last year. It hurt them in that regard. The other thing that we can say about what was happening in the southern end of the Mississippi Flyway is, Louisiana had one of its worst years on record in terms of hurricanes, and so that had some very noticeable influences on the quality of their coastal marsh habitat. So yeah, that's what went on in the early part of the season.
Yeah. I had the opportunity to go to Stuttgart for the first time last December. So before COVID, right before the world lost its mind. And the guy, he calls me a week before. He's like, man, we've seen like 3 ducks in like the last week.
Yeah.
And so I know they had a bad season in 1920, and it sounds like they had another bad season in 2021.
Yeah. 19. Now, you said 1920. Did you mean 2019?
Yeah. 19 and the 2019,
okay.
2020
waterfowl
season. I don't know what the
I
hell
thought
they
you were going way back with me there.
No.
Okay.
So it looks like they've had back-to-back poor seasons, and he was like, "Hey, it's for me it was like a 6-7 hour drive, and I was like 3 ducks." And I was like, "I appreciate the invite, and I'd like to come to Stuttgart, obviously, greenhead capital of the world, but
sure."
He was like, "It's not worth it."
And,
but anyway, so.
Yeah, Arkansas had a tough season last year. They really did. There's no secret to that, and a lot of that is going to be early. They were not a beneficiary of that early cold weather because they just did not have the habitat. Then we kind of look at what happened the rest of the season once they finally did get some water on the landscape. Well, I'm going to look at some figures here for November, December, and January. We were at exceptionally mild temperatures north of us. If you look at the southern end of the flyway from these figures, things were about average. And that was one of the things here in Tennessee that I was even noticing is that, this feels kind of average. But if you looked in the Dakotas, in Minnesota, in Nebraska, they were, let me look at this scale here, anywhere on average up to 12, 15 degrees above average.
Yeah. Well, and I saw lots of people in the Dakotas and Great Lakes regions shooting ducks when you would have thought, December, January, all their stuff should have been frozen up, and those ducks should have been down here. I'm like, what? How are they still shooting ducks in the Dakotas? But it's just like you said, 12 degrees is a big. That's a lot.
And that's an average, and so that's one of the things that we really, the waterfowl management community is wanting to get a better handle on what part of the temperature regime is most responsible for some of these changes that we may be seeing in some years. And you can look at an average, but does an average temperature over the course of a month really capture the aspect of weather temperature in this regard it's going to influence duck movements, and you start to think about things like, well, how long did it get below freezing? Those types of things. And then what we're really curious about is what do the long-term weather trends tell us about that? And we've done some investigation of that. And it's when you get those cold spells, it's not staying cold as long. And if you're a duck, that's great. Ducks are perfectly built to withstand short, even really cold bouts of inclement weather. I mean, they can do that. They can pack on a lot of fat. And if you're only getting 3 to 4 days of really cold temperature, a lot of these more cold hardy species like mallards and black ducks, they're gonna tough it out. And so I figure that's one of the things that we're seeing. You look at this ice cover, these ice cover figures, they're just shocking. They show the long-term average of ice cover on each of the Great Lakes, and the estimate of the percent of ice cover on some of these lakes. Just go to Lake Erie. It's the shallowest of those lakes. By late January, there's usually about 40 to 50% ice cover on the Great Lake on that lake.
Mm-hmm.
This year, it was bouncing around below 10%.
Wow. Yeah.
So, I mean, it was dramatic. And so, from that type of weather pattern influences waterfowl from a couple of different ways. One is it's going to influence how those birds are distributed kind of north, south, and even east, west throughout the flyway. But when you have a year where you don't get a lot of even short-term changes in temperature, or significant rain events to put new habitat on the landscape, there's nothing happening to cause birds to do something different from the pattern that they've developed.
Oh
So
yeah. The few birds we had got stale
yeah,
really quickly. I
that's
mean,
right.
local birds, and they were here and they knew the routine. And once you started calling, they were like,
Yeah,
no, thank you.
yeah,
But like you said, they didn't have any incentive to go anywhere else.
yeah,
The
that's
weather
right.
was the same for most of the season.
That's right. And when
Um,
it's mild, they don't have as great a need um, to feed. They're not physiologically, energetically stressed.
mhm.
Um, they get up and they search and they say, yeah, it's same habitat that I've looked at for the past few days. I know what's there. But whenever it rains, even if it's 60 or 70 degrees, if you get rain that causes some overbank flooding, you're going to get birds that start moving around. And if you're able to move and into those areas that are newly flooded, chances are you did okay,
Yeah,
even in those circumstances.
right. Yeah. So that explains a lot as far as the weather up north. I think was a huge
Yeah,
factor because we had a
yeah,
mild winter here, but that was obviously reflected farther north. Um, I will say it gave me hope though when we had snowmageddon down here, which us
yeah,
Texans don't know how to deal with. But oh my god, I wish I was duck hunting. I mean, there were so many ducks, so
yeah,
it was nice to at least see that
yeah,
when we got the cold weather, they did show up, albeit in February.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
we had our longest. Our season started later than it ever had, and it ended later than it ever had in Texas. And the flyways can adopt. The states can adopt their own season dates based off of the management plan that's, I guess, put in place by the flyway.
yeah,
So we had only had like a 5 day split, which was the shortest because we had started later to end later. So I
yeah.
had such high hopes, and this was the first year that I ever had spent money on a duck lease specifically. Um, and I was like, God, wish I had that $1,500 back.
Yeah,
We went
yeah,
the last day of the season, and we shot 3 ducks, and that was like the best hunt we'd had in weeks.
yeah.
So it was just, I'd never seen it, and I hope I never see it again. I'll put
Well,
it
I
that way.
know. And we mentioned Dr. Tom Mormon a bit earlier. This was one of his worst years ever. Also, I think heard until like the last week of the season. I think he shot only one duck all season. Now, I think the truth is it might have only been a he might have only been able to claim half of that duck.
Oh, wow.
He and his good buddy Jerry Holden, our director of operations there in the southern region, I think they both claimed about half of that duck. So yeah, I mean there was no doubt it was a tough season. The other thing that's important to kind of remember, and we highlighted in this report, is that it all starts with the production that occurred the previous season.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, while conditions were good in the Dakotas, they were not really good in Prairie Canada, and we don't have data. I guess we'll have age ratio data here at some point based off of some of the harvest surveys, but our assessment, kind of based on what we were hearing, is that production last year at best would have probably been average.
Mm.
So for southern states, productivity on an annual basis really becomes important, for what you see from year to year. That's the other thing I'll say, Cable, that gets a bit complex about these conversations is one part of the conversation is, well, what happened this year?
Mm-hmm.
And then the other part of the conversation is, well, what's happening to the trend over time?
Mm-hmm.
And those two, obviously, your individual years, combine to make up that long-term trend. But those are, in many respects, the same factors are operating, but there's a different time scale there, and those conversations kind of take two different uh, they take on two different I guess characters in some respects. So
Okay. We've got about 5 minutes left. I
oop,
did want to ask you, speaking of long-term trends, and it might have even been with Dr. Mormon that we discussed this, but changes in not so much the migration itself, but the habitat that ducks are using.
mhm.
Is there anything to the idea that they are using smaller water bodies more frequently and are looking for more stock tanks, farm ponds, less less dependent on reservoirs and certainly the coast?
Yeah, so we're talking about Texas here, and I'm reasonably familiar with that data, having
Mm-hmm.
worked out at the Gulf Coast Joint Venture for a number of years, and I know Texas has one of the best. I mean, it's only they fly the survey only once in January, but they cover the entire state, at least the areas that have waterfowl habitat, and it's a great data set for looking at what's happening in terms of waterfowl distributions or seeing how waterfowl distributions can change. I think sometimes we have to think about this from the way of just like we're observing what the birds are doing in response to the landscape that they have. And there are
Right.
numerous factors that influence that landscape, and humans are right at the center of every aspect of it, right? The weather, of course. So we don't want to get into that argument, that kind of discussion, um, but in terms of the landscape itself, humans are at the center of that and what it looks like, and waterfowl respond to that. And so the data from those surveys clearly show an increase, and harvest survey data show this as well, an increase in the number of waterfowl harvested out of that Oaks and Prairies region where you've got all of those stock tanks and all of those ponds. And I don't, ducks are going to select habitats that give them the best chance to satisfy their resource needs while not getting shot. They don't want to get shot. They, what they want to do is survive and get back to the breeding grounds every single year, just like every bird tries to do. Doesn't matter if it's a duck or a passerine, they're trying to survive and get back so they can produce that next generation. And so, if those stock tanks, when they come on the landscape, if they provide security from disturbance, if they provide access to some food resources, we should absolutely expect ducks to use those. And I think there's a couple of data streams that I'm familiar with that show, yeah, that's happening, and that's not a surprise, especially when you layer in what we know about warming temperatures and milder winter temperatures, and that kind of influencing how far they may feel the need to go south. So you've actually got a couple of things there that may be influencing their decision to continue south. One is the availability of this habitat up in the Oaks and Prairies, and the rolling plains, and then the other would be warmer temperatures that just allow them to hang out at more northern latitudes with less energetic stress than they historically did.
Okay. So interesting stuff there. And maybe not necessarily even a bad thing. Just we as hunters have to adapt.
Oh, absolutely.
Can't control the weather, but you can find ducks if you just
Yeah.
continue to look in different places.
Cable, I think that's the number one message that we as a waterfowl management community have to do a better job of is communicating what it is we're understanding about waterfowl migration and movements and how they respond to the landscape, and then encouraging hunters to themselves figure out how to adapt to those changes. It's We should never expect waterfowl populations or any migratory bird population to get in a long-term stable pattern. That's just not the way they operate.
Mm-hmm.
That's what has allowed them to persist for thousands of years, their ability to adapt to an ever-changing landscape. We have to do a better job encouraging our supporters, our hunters, our members to learn to adapt in response to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, Mike, I certainly appreciate it. Real quick, if you want to plug the DU podcast, where can folks consume that?
Sure. We are starting season 4 of the Ducks Unlimited podcast. You can get that at through any of the apps where you get your podcast, Apple, Spotify, Google. I think you can go to ducks.org/podcast or just Google Ducks Unlimited podcast and you'll find it. We just started season 4 here at the 1st of May.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly enjoying it and have enjoyed the conversation today. Thanks for coming on and shedding some light on what was a terrible season for a lot of us, but hopefully, there's always next year.
Yeah. Well, that's right. We are eternal optimists. We know that if there's one thing we know, the Ducks will come. They will head south again next year. Yeah. Where they go, in what abundance, that remains to be seen.
Yes, sir. Well, thank
again,
you,
Mike.
Cable.
You bet. Thank you, Cable. Anytime, man.
All right. Hey, I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
I'll be sure to tag DU and send you an email whenever this is up. So
absolutely, and yeah, I will send you right now a copy of this report. We were supposed to get this on our. Let me final. That's a high res. I think. Let me just do this one. Yeah. Yeah, we were supposed to get that up on our website. I don't know if we have it up there or not, but anyway, feel free to post that, attach it to this in the comment section of this,
I will.
This episode absolutely. Or on your website, whatever, man.
Thanks for sending that over.
Yeah, and anytime you want to hop on and talk about anything else, let me know, man.
Okay. Hey, have a great one. Thank you.
All right. Yep, you too.
Bye.
Bye.